One sunny summer afternoon when I was a teenager. I apologize, there's some sawing happening outside of the window. I don't know if you can hear that, but I can. So one sunny summer afternoon when I was a teenager, I biked home in the middle of the day and parked my bike in our garage. When I turned the handle of the door to walk in the house like I had done millions of times before, I walked inside and saw coats strewn across the floor in front of the coat closet. And as I made my way down to the basement to let our dog out, yes, we kept our dog in the basement while we were out, I heard footsteps and voices from upstairs. It sounded like they were running out of the house. My heart began racing, and I began to see what I had already sensed, that something was off. Stuff was out of place everywhere, strewn about. And I didn't linger or look much longer, but went to our phone, the old kind that still hung on the wall, and dialed my parents. With no answer, I decided to turn to a trusted family friend who I called and then hurried outside to wait for him. And when he arrived, he gently listened to me explain that I thought that someone had broken into our house, that I thought that they had still been there when I got home, and that I hadn't wanted to stay in the house to search for what may have been taken. With his reassurance, I called the police. And unlike my friend who arrived to listen, believe me, and support me, unfortunately, the officer seemed distrustful of my teenage self, questioned whether one of my families could have left the house so disheveled. When I couldn't identify a single specific item that had been taken, he left, told me to have my parents call when they got home. It did turn out that whoever had broken in had taken some instruments, jewelry, and other items, but that doesn't really matter. What stays with me 20 years later is the feeling in my stomach when someone who I turned to for help didn't believe me, wanted some sort of proof beyond what I offered as my experience. This morning, we hear the story of Jesus first appearing to the disciples. We often refer to this as the Doubting Thomas story. But to be clear, it isn't just Thomas who relies on visual proof to decide to believe in the risen Christ. And beyond the proof of Jesus standing before them, all of the disciples are looking for a specific kind of proof. They are uniformly focused on his wounds. Why were Thomas and the rest of the disciples so focused on seeing Jesus's wounds? Thomas gets a bad rap, but to be clear, all of the disciples come to believe in this story only after seeing Jesus's wounds, not after he shows up and says, "Peace be with you," but only after he shows them his hands and his side does the first group of disciples recognize him. What is it about the disciples, about people, that makes us so hung up on seeing wounds firsthand? If you don't believe me that as a society we are a bit obsessed with this proof of wounds, we need only look to our criminal justice system that continued this week to belabor the trial of a murder that had dozens of witnesses and was caught on camera and broadcast to the world. How many witnesses were called just to pinpoint, describe, and prove not just that George Floyd died with Derek Chauvin's knee on his neck, but exactly, scientifically, how and why life left his body. I couldn't bring myself to watch the video of Derek Chauvin kneeling on George Floyd's neck. Couldn't bear to watch 8 minutes and 15 seconds of agony. And I haven't watched the trial these past weeks either. And I wrestle with the privilege to not be confronted with these images. My ability to choose not to see. Growing up as a white person in this country, the racism and brutality of the criminal justice system has not always been apparent to me. It has taken the publicizing of police violence against Black people and other people of color to turn the tide of public opinion. It's not that police brutality against people of color is new or even more prevalent now than 10 years ago. But as many have suggested, now that every phone is a camera and every camera can share to the world, now those of us who have not seen, not believed, not understood this reality, we've finally witnessed the truth. 66 years ago, Mamie Till Bradley insisted on an open casket funeral for her 14-year-old son. Her 14-year-old son, Emmett Till, who was lynched while visiting relatives in Mississippi. She chose to do this because, in her words, "I wanted the world to see what they did to my baby." Bradley clearly knew that there was power in showing the world the brutality of white supremacy, to insist on making people see what it does to Black bodies, to Black mothers' sons. Her bravery in bearing her pain publicly was a turning point in the long freedom struggle against racism in our country. But why does it continue to be contingent on publicly available visual proof when the patterns of racism and police brutality are long established, long proven, researched, studied, cited, taught, written about, preached about, and shown? Can we not believe without seeing? This is not the only circumstance in which we see this pattern. The Me Too movement has urged us to believe women, and yet we see still that something more than women's experience and testimony is often needed for accountability to be had. Can we not believe without seeing? This week, we marked the beginning of Yom HaShoah, or Holocaust Day of Remembrance, held a service with the Montclair Clergy Association to mark the day. And unfortunately, services like these have become all the more important because of the recent rise in anti-Semitism that is often tied to Holocaust denial. It's beyond my comprehension, and I'm sure yours, how anyone can deny the Holocaust. And yet there are those who continue to say that if they did not see it, they don't believe it. These examples may seem widely disparate, and indeed there are differences in them. But there is some common thread of humanity's denial, our refusal, our inability to see that which is in plain view, and our obsession with demanding that the victims trot out the graphic evidence for us, the privileged bystanders, to see. We know that the way each of us sees the world is strongly conditioned by our own place in it, our own roles, experiences, and perspectives. And this is as much one of the wonderful and awe-inspiring parts of our humanity, our own uniqueness. But it also demands that we regard our own point of view with humility, that we consider the toll it takes on the victims, that we have to be shown to understand something outside of our own experience. We recognize the profound generosity of Jesus's vulnerability, his willingness to have his wounds examined as evidence, his comfort with his body being displayed as evidence. If Jesus's resurrection is the beginning of a new way of being, we can wonder whether he wished that he would be the last victim who would not be believed at his word, the last person whose suffering would be dissected and distrusted. While the group of disciples rejoices after seeing the wounds of the risen Christ, it is Thomas who declares first, "My Lord and my God," We often hear this as Thomas's recognition that it is Jesus. But perhaps this is showing us that Thomas, unlike the other disciples, not only recognizes Jesus, but empathizes with his pain and woundedness. My Lord, my God. And maybe that's all the difference. He sees not for proof, but witnesses with empathy. In response to this, to seeing the pain and suffering of Jesus, the disciples move from their place of hiding and fear. Maybe they are beginning to move from denial and unwillingness to encounter the reality of Jesus' death and the danger it brought, to a place of recognition and witness, moving out of their sheltered place and into the world to be witnesses. It may be a coincidence that in the English language, witness can be understood as seeing something with your own eyes firsthand, but also as a verb that means to share your Christian testimony. In this world that is full of violence and victimization, we may not always get to choose what we see or don't see, but we have the choice to become witnesses, to take what we see or is shown to us and believe. Believe not just the seen, but the longer and unseen wounds beneath the surface. Witnesses to the wounds, but more so, witnesses to the people who have been wounded. Those of us who encounter the world from a position of privilege, recognizing that all of our identities are multifaceted, we have the responsibility to teach ourselves to witness, to learn about patterns and histories so that we can begin to let go of our need to see and examine the details every time racism shows up, every time sexism shows up, every time suffering shows up. Beyond seeing, we must become witnesses. And we are blessed to be part of a community that has committed to this ongoing work of witness in the world. And this week we begin a new component of that work. Over the next 2 months, our Racial Justice Task Force will lead us in a series of 4 conversations, educational opportunities around topics related to racial justice. Today, they will introduce the first topic of implicit bias and invite us to stay following the service for conversation and learning. I especially invite those of us who have not carried the burden of experiencing racism to take this opportunity to learn, perhaps to see in a new way, that we might be better witnesses in the world. Jesus said, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe." Blessed are we when there is no more racial trauma and violence to see. Blessed are we when we don't have to see it to believe the survivors and victims. Blessed are those who do not just see, but witness. Blessed are we when we believe that Christ shows us a way out of these patterns of violence, beginning with his resurrection. May it be so.